The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Debate Review Part 3 of Matt Dillahunty versus Mike Licona. Did Jesus rise from the dead? So I think this will probably bring this debate review to a close, and I don't expect to go on too long. If you actually watch the rebuttal section and the cross-examination session, there's a lot of stuff that comes up. There's stuff that comes up about Paul, and I had said, Paul never met Jesus. And he was bothered by the fact that I was making this assertion. I was explaining that I'm not claiming I am now convinced and can demonstrate that Paul never met Jesus. That sort of universal negative, or that's not the case. I was merely, as I pointed out in the debate, going with the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis that I've never met Jesus, I've never met Paul, I've never met President Trump, until such time as we have evidence that I have, that these two things are not connected until then. That's why I spent so much time talking about the null hypothesis during my opening, was to hopefully kind of get around to these issues so that we could talk more about what was justified. As it turns out, and as I've mentioned before, it seems that the usage of the term supernatural in this debate was, as I pointed out, just a bucket to throw anything that doesn't have a natural explanation. And Mike took issue with this because he pointed out, I'm not saying something is supernatural merely because I don't have a naturalistic explanation. His added component was that it needs to seem to be impossible based on our current understanding of nature. But that is not enough to justify saying, oh, it seems impossible based on our current understanding of nature. Therefore, we are justified in concluding that it's supernatural. And as he was explaining in this clip here, which I'll show in a moment, that wasn't his actual position. He was not suggesting that this was just because it, based on our current information, it seems impossible, etc.
Okay. All right, Matt. So you were talking about how you said both in your opening statement and your rebuttal that people attribute to the supernatural when there is no other natural explanation available that they can think of. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to be clear that that is not at all what I was saying.
So that's what he says, and yet just a couple minutes later, he says this.
Something either has a natural or supernatural cause if our current understanding of nature and natural law suggests that that is impossible, which it certainly does, then it seems to me one is justified in inferring that it's a supernatural cause. You can always, if some scientist discovers later on that, nature can indeed do this, well, then you'd have to readjust your conclusion. But in the meantime, it's based on what we currently know from science and natural law that would seem to suggest that is impossible by natural causes. And so we would be right to infer a supernatural cause.
So this is precisely what I'm talking about. If it seems impossible, given our current understanding, he thinks you're justified in inferring a supernatural explanation, except that that's not the case. The sound standing of it seems impossible, and yet we've witnessed it, is to recognize that there's a conflict between what we've observed, or apparently observed, and what we think is possible or impossible. That puts us in a position where we now have something which is unexplained, which may even seem impossible. And there are a number of potential explanations. Number one, our understanding of what is or isn't possible may be wrong. To deny this as a viable option seems a little dishonest, especially if your explanation is to go rushing to, therefore it must be supernatural. And as we pointed out during this debate, saying that it's supernatural doesn't tell us anything. Essentially, he's saying, hey, this seems impossible given our understanding of nature. We don't have a natural explanation for it. Therefore, it's supernatural. And what he means by supernatural in that context of reaching a conclusion is it's not natural and seems impossible. It seems to be beyond the bounds of nature. But he wants to use this impression that people get where they say something can't be natural or isn't natural, or we can conclude it's supernatural, and use that later on to prop up the idea for the resurrection. As a matter of fact, we had this discussion during the cross-examination period where he was like, I have provided 4 lines of evidence for the supernatural. No, you provided 4 stories, anecdotal accounts that people claim are supernatural. And their reasons for claiming that they're supernatural are yours, that they think it's impossible under natural circumstances, which makes this kind of argument a little circular, that the examples you're using are using the same flawed methodology of reaching a conclusion that X is supernatural. And he wants to use that, and he says later that if the supernatural realm exists, then resurrection is possible. That is also not true, as I pointed out in the debate, which is why I don't need to go into it too much. But I see no reason to conclude that there might be a supernatural realm, and yet resurrection is still impossible. The supernatural realm doesn't mean that anything becomes possible. It just means that there's a realm beyond nature. What the specifics of that realm are, we don't know. And you don't get to say that resurrection is possible if the supernatural realm exists until you can define the supernatural realm, what its capabilities are, what is and isn't possible under that model. So this entire debate, where we spent a lot of time talking about the supernatural and very little time talking about did Jesus rise from the dead, is Dr. Licona's attempt to say, hey, it seems like there might be supernatural things, and if that's the case, then why wouldn't resurrection be one possible option under the supernatural realm? I don't know. First, you need to demonstrate that there actually is a supernatural realm, and we need to determine what its capabilities are, what can and can't happen from the supernatural realm. Can it actually interact with reality? What can be done or can't be done within this supernatural realm that you're proposing? And then show that resurrection is one of the things that can be done from it. And then show that we have a set of pieces of evidence that show that someone was actually dead, his example of somebody cutting his head off, or in this case, Jesus being killed and buried, and that a resurrection is now a plausible explanation. The entire debate is a cheat. The entire debate is an attempt to prop up the notion of the resurrection as plausible by making it seem like it's a natural, it follows naturally, or supernaturally, I guess you should say, from the idea that a supernatural realm exists. But in the answer we just listened to, he points out essentially that you're justified in accepting a supernatural explanation, and if at some time later scientists come along and offer an explanation, then you revise your position. This is the antithesis of skepticism and critical thinking. What we should do is reserve judgment and say, I don't have an explanation until such time as we do. This is all about the discomfort with saying, I don't know. And this is why his example about him coming back from the dead after having had his head chopped off was so frustrating, because the people in the audience, Licona's over there smirking. Oh, well, you wouldn't even accept the supernatural. No, I would accept that I saw you dead, and now I see you not dead, and I can see the scars, and I would accept the events that happened. It is, what is the explanation for this occurrence? Now, I don't have one. I'm open to a natural explanation, and I'm open to a supernatural explanation, provided someone can actually demonstrate that that is the case. But Licona's epistemology, while he accused mine of being flawed, is, this would seem to be impossible under what we know about nature. Therefore, it's supernatural. And I'll go ahead and go with that until somebody proves me wrong. Essentially, until scientists show a natural explanation. I'm going to make this leap of faith, and I will hold this, and I will call myself reasonably, rationally justified in holding that position until I'm proven wrong. That's not the way skepticism or critical thinking works, but that is the way a desperate fear of acknowledging when you don't know what the explanation is. That's how that works. I can't possibly just sit here and say, I don't know what happened. And this is all secondary to whether or not the information that's been provided about the events is reliable. Was there a Jesus? Was he crucified? Was he buried? Did his body disappear? Did he disappear under circumstances that would be consistent with a resurrection? None of these are answerable questions. Now, as a historian, he's just willing to trust the sources that he has. And that's fine. if we're talking about mundane things, if we say so-and-so had a dog, because there's no risk in a worldview altering belief coming from that. It's not fine when it's, hey, this person is God, and this is what you must then do from it. And it's rather convenient that we seem to be counting eyewitness testimony when it's convenient with the beliefs that he holds, and ignoring eyewitness testimony when it comes to things like alien abductions and things like that, that we also talked about. But there's another couple of clips I want to take a look at.
But I'm not going to say that it's supernatural because somewhere along the line we might find a natural explanation. That's the nature of the gaps.
So no, that's actually not correct. It's not a nature of the gaps argument. If I was saying, we may someday find a naturalistic explanation, therefore the explanation is natural, that would be a nature of the gaps argument. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm not accepting a natural explanation that we might find in the future. I'm not arguing that there's a gap in our knowledge of what is possible naturally, which will be filled with a naturalistic explanation. That's not my position at all. I'm rejecting the assertion, the unwarranted assertion of a supernatural explanation that is based merely on our understanding that this seems to be impossible. Now, some of this may come down to Mike's label of supernatural, as we pointed out in the debate itself. It seems to just be a bucket for, I don't have an explanation naturally, and it seems impossible under what we know about nature, so I'm just going to put it in this bucket. And that would be fine, no matter what you want to label that. You could label it tentatively not naturally explained or tentatively naturally impossible. You can do that as long as you don't then say, but now we have all these things in this bucket which I have labeled supernatural, and therefore it suggests that there's a supernatural realm. This is the fundamental flaw in his entire case, which basically ignores the resurrection but tries to prop it up with the supernatural. In some cases, when he says supernatural, he, as we showed, simply means this is, based on our current understanding, impossible, and therefore we're going to put it in this bucket and label it supernatural. We're not claiming that it is God or that we have an explanation, just that it's supernatural. Then he takes that bucket, which is just all the things that seem naturally impossible, yet we have somehow observed. Because it's now labeled supernatural, he can use an equivocation fallacy to move it over here and say, hey, look at all these things in this bucket that I have labeled supernatural. That suggests that there's a supernatural realm. No, it doesn't. That bucket suggests that there are observations which are inconsistent with what we know about nature. That doesn't mean that we're reasonable in concluding there's a supernatural realm. But then he takes that bucket of supernatural and then he moves it over here after suggesting that there's a supernatural realm and starts making claims that a resurrection would be possible. And as we talked about earlier, there's no connection between those things at all. So it's not a nature of the gaps argument unless I am making a positive claim that there's a natural explanation which we'll find in the future. And I'm not saying that. My position, which is very uncomfortable for them, is I don't know. First of all, I don't know if the events that are reported happened as they're reported, because I don't know who the authors are. I have no way to investigate. I don't think that eyewitness testimony is reliable. And that is the beginning point that cascades down here to where he's willing to make all these leaps. And I'm starting at the beginning saying, we're not even justified in saying we have a good understanding of what happened. And yet you're going to, it needs to have a supernatural explanation. When I'm like, I don't know what the explanation is, but I'd really like to know first, did this stuff actually happen? Are we just going to take it on faith that it happened? Oh, no, we're going to rely on eyewitness testimony. And that gets us to this.
Eyewitness testimony, and you said that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. There's no question that eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. And in some cases, of course, it's notoriously unreliable, but overall, it is quite reliable. And if we're going to say that all eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, then forget the legal system. There's no such thing as good witnesses. And let's all face it, most of us in here, I'm 55, most of you in here will remember 9/11. I'll bet you remember where you were at, what you were doing, even what the weather was like that day, and that's reliable stuff.
No, I'm sorry. It's actually not reliable stuff. And it's unfortunate for Dr. Licona that he picked this particular example to hang his hat on about 9/11 and memory, because there's actually a study that was done about flashbulb memories that focused on 9/11, where they interviewed people 1 week after 9/11, or a week and a half, to set their baseline of details that were remembered. Then they interviewed those people a year later, and then they interviewed them 3 years later. Now, I'll put a link right here to the Scientific American article that references the study, and from there you can go find out the actual facts about the study. If you'll forgive me for just a moment for looking off to the right where I have a screen with the information, I want to get these numbers right. So 1 week afterwards, they did the survey about the details. 1 year later, they interviewed those same people. Their accuracy rate for details, not, hey, did it happen, but the details surrounding that event, was 63% 1 year later. 3 years later, that drops to 57% accurate on details. That's significant. And we know and understand that memory is flawed, that it is malleable, that it is affected by emotions, by interactions, and by information that we get after the fact, that we rewrite our memories a bit. There was 94% accuracy on the number of planes involved in the attack 1 week after the event. That accuracy dropped at the 1 year mark to 86%. Now, that's not a catastrophic drop, but it's a little lower. It still means that 14% of the people they surveyed after 1 year had already managed to get the number of planes involved incorrect. And at 3 years, that drops to 81%. Other questions they asked, where was President Bush? Now, this isn't about the planes, but it is something that was, documented at the time. They were 87% accurate immediately following 9/11. 1 year later, that dropped to 57% on where was President Bush. And 3 years later, that climbed back up to 81%. Well, hang on a minute. We were losing our accuracy. How is it that they managed to go from, 57% back up to 81% between the 1 and 3 year mark? Well, an interesting thing happened, and that is that Michael Moore released Fahrenheit 9/11. And of those people who were involved in the survey, it's likely that a good many of them saw it and saw other footage, documentary type footage, that refreshed their memory. We dropped accuracy significantly after 1 year, but by the time we get to the 3 year mark, this particular instance, it has risen up because it was a key feature. It was kind of a bit of mockery. What was Bush doing during all of this? But the interesting thing for me is we now have at least one study, there are many others that you can find, about flashbulb memories of significant points in time, where what the details that we're presented with diminish as time goes on. But we also know that they're malleable. And one question is, if Michael Moore's film had managed to get the facts wrong about where Bush was, would that accuracy have dropped even further? Would people be remembering what the film showed them that was factually incorrect and using that to replace their memories? Eyewitness testimony is not the single most unreliable thing ever. When I say it's notoriously unreliable, I mean that we know there are problems with it. We know about false memories. We know that we get details wrong. We've all experienced this. And it also happens with significant events, flashbulb memories, which are part of this study. To suggest that we should rely on eyewitness testimony for significant facts about important things is just fundamentally flawed. And when he was talking about eyewitness testimony, he also mentioned that, we'd have to throw out the entire criminal justice system as well. No, actually, we wouldn't. We've dealt with this issue. What we have is the process by which we establish probable cause, and we have standards of evidence such that I don't think any of us would accept that a person would be convicted of a murder based solely on eyewitness accounts when there is no body, no weapon, no demonstration of means, motive, or opportunity, and just people saying, I saw Matt Dillahunty kill this guy. I'm convinced of it. And that was it. If you then move that account a couple of thousand years in the past, there's no reason it should become more believable when you don't have the ability to interview those witnesses and talk to them. And this is one of the reasons why I brought up alien abduction thing, which Mike also discounts, and he has reasons for discounting it. But the truth of the matter is there's nothing supernatural about those accounts. There may be something supernatural given his let's toss everything in a bucket that we don't understand and that seems impossible. Oh, it seems impossible to traverse those distances. You don't know what the capabilities are, and if there's an advanced population that knows more about space travel than we do. I'm not arguing for alien abductions. I think they're crap as well. But what I am pointing out is that it seems strange that someone is willing to say, you know what, despite the fact that there's nothing supernatural about this, the eyewitness testimony alone just isn't enough. It doesn't seem like it's plausible under what we know of nature. And yet, to do the exact opposite when it comes to a claim about a resurrection. Now, there was a lot of Q&A during this. You can go watch that. I don't think I need to go through and review every Q&A question. There was one incredibly significant moment where some people who were members of the church that I attended 30 years ago showed up, and one of them asked me a question which allowed me to kind of give my personal atheist testimony of how I got from there to here. But when it comes to the resurrection, this debate did not present evidence for the resurrection. This debate was all about the supernatural and do we have sufficient evidence to justify it. And one of the things was every time we came up with an example, it was this amazingly clear, constructed example. You cut off my head, I come back to life, and I give you a message from someone that only they would know. And as I pointed out during the debate, when that happens, give me a call and we can discuss that. But until then, you're just coming up with prime examples that still don't prove your point. We'll see you next time.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.